Right, well, welcome everyone to our Zoom event this evening with our guest speaker, Roy Webb. My name is Candace Cravens, and I'm the Executive Director of the John Wesley Powell River History Museum here in Green River, Utah. And I'm so excited to welcome you all to this event this evening. I know we have folks from near and far tuning in tonight. One of the great wonders of Zoom is being able to expand our reach near and far across the country, across the state. So it's great to have you all here. I'm going to go ahead and do a quick little intro to our speaker and also tell you a little bit about this event and why we're doing it. So this event this evening is part of our Smithsonian Waterways programming. So if you haven't had the chance to stop by the museum recently, we have a wonderful traveling exhibit from the Smithsonian Institution called Waterways. And this is part of a larger statewide initiative from Utah Humanities and Museum on Main Street. Waterways has been doing a tour of the state of Utah, and originally we were supposed to be the first museum in the state to host the exhibit, but due to COVID and 2020, we're actually the last to host the exhibit. So we're really excited the exhibit is here. It's going to be here through June 6th. And we've put together a variety of programs related to different water topics to go along with the exhibit. So this talk tonight is one of those events. We have a couple more things left for May. We'll be doing a yoga at Swayze's Beach class on May 15th, on Saturday, May 15th at 9 a.m. And we have one more Zoom lecture by Greg Smoke of the American West Heritage Center. He is our state scholar for the whole Waterways Think Water Utah program, and he will be giving a talk later in the month. You can find all of those details the same place you found the details for tonight's talk, our Facebook page or our website. And you can find that registration link if you're interested in any of those events. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and give a quick intro to our speaker tonight, and then I will turn it over to him. So tonight's guest speaker is Roy Webb, and Roy grew up in Farmington, New Mexico. He was born in Farmington, New Mexico, in 1952. He grew up on the banks of the San Juan and Animas River, across from the river from the Navajo Nation. After much wandering, he earned bachelor's and master's degrees in history from the University of Utah. He was an archivist with the Special Collections Department, the J. Willard Merritt Library, University of Utah, from 1983 until he retired in 2018. He started in the manuscripts division, but in 1994 took over the multimedia archives, in charge of the historic photograph and film collections. Under the auspices of the S.J. Quinney Outdoor Recreation Archives, he developed the Utah River Running Archives, which includes one of the most comprehensive collections of pre-dam photos of Glen Canyon anywhere in the country. He has written 5 books and many articles, book reviews, and other pieces on the history of river running on the Green and Colorado rivers. He was the Wilbur R. Jacobs Fellow at the Huntington Library in San Marino, California. In 2004, he conducted research for his book, Lost Canyons of the Green River, and he's taught classes on the history of river running, has been a consultant and appeared in a number of video and television documentaries about river running, and he has spoken to hundreds of times before groups ranging from academic and professional conferences to local history groups to gatherings of river guides in a drafty boathouse. He's a charter member of the Colorado Plateau River Runner Guides, a former guide member of the Grand Canyon River Guides Association, and he is the chair of our board for the John Wesley Powell River History Museum, and he's also a member of the River Runners Hall of Fame Committee. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Roy Webb. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Candace. Am I unmuted? Okay. Thanks very much for that nice introduction. And also especially thanks to the Powell Museum of River History for the invitation to participate in the Smithsonian Waterways Think Water program. I would encourage everyone, if you happen to be passing through Green River, to stop and see the Smithsonian exhibit and the Powell Museum, which is a real treasure. Now, if you're watching this program, you're probably already aware of the story of John Wesley Powell. You've heard about his bravery in the Civil War, about losing his right arm to a Confederate bullet at the Battle of Shiloh, how he overcame that to not only fight through the rest of the war, but how he came west to explore the last unknown region in the United States, the canyons of the Colorado River. You'll know about the famous stories of the 1869 expedition, the wreck at Disaster Falls, the struggles in Cataract Canyon, his doubts in the Grand Canyon, where he wrote, "We are now ready to start on our way down the great unknown," and the exit of 3 of the crew members at what is now known as Separation Rapid at the end of the Grand Canyon. What you might not know as well is the story of the 1871 expedition, and this is the 150th anniversary of that, when Powell and a wholly different crew returned to complete the scientific work that the major had not been able to accomplish in the first trip, which had turned into a race for survival. Most of the real accomplishments ascribed to Powell in mapping, geology, ethnology, and other work came from the members of the 1871 crew, who were educated, trained scientists and surveyors, not the rough and tumble gang of frontiersmen and grizzled veterans of 1869. The other thing most people might not be aware of are the experiences of both crews in the upper canyons of the Green River, now entombed by Flaming Gorge Reservoir. But the upper stretches of the Green, including Flaming Gorge, Horseshoe, Kingfisher, and Red Canyons, are where the crew members gained their first experience handling the ungainly boats, experienced their first thrills of fast water, and ran and portaged their first rapids. In those remote and little-known canyons in Wyoming and Utah, they first realized just what they were facing. Their experiences in Red Canyon and in such dangerous rapids as Skull Creek and Ashley Falls gave them their start in learning the skills that prepared them for the dangers to come in the rest of the Colorado River canyons. Okay, so I'm sorry, I don't have the name of the guy who painted this. He did it for the 1869, did a whole series of paintings that are just wonderful. He lives in Colorado, and if you're interested, let me know and I'll look it up. Oops. Okay. So here's what Powell saw in 1869 when he showed up with his boats and his crew. This is Green River City, which was barely a few months old in 1869. It was a hell on wheels, end of the line railroad town just a few weeks before. And the Transcontinental Railroad passed through. And of course, on May 10th, just 2 weeks before Powell left, had joined the rails at Promontory in Utah. You can see the famous butte there of Green River. Here's another couple of views of Green River. These are taken in 1922 by the USGS crew that was doing a dam site survey, the Woolley survey. And on the top one, you can see Expedition Island, which is where Powell started from. The city is in the background. There's Expedition Island, which is now a National Historic Site. And if you pass through Green River, you can stop, and there's around the island, there's a walkway with a lot of kiosks about river runners who started from there. It's very, very interesting. The lower one, just kind of to show what Powell did, exactly what the USGS did. Up here on the upper photo, you can see the railroad bridge to the left, and he got his boats off, floated them down to Expedition Island, and got ready to go. Here's the camp as they got ready. This is about the same place. This is in 1871. What the big difference of the 1871 trip was that they had a camera. They had a photographer, a guy named E.O. Beeman, Ellis Oler Beeman from New York, who brought his camera along to take pictures. And here's the 1871 crew. Beeman is at the far left. The member of the crew who left in this trip, Frank Richardson, is at the far right. What the camera he brought was a great big wet plate camera. And this is an illustration, a contemporary illustration that shows you what it was like to take a picture with those cameras. You had a glass plate, a large glass plate. You had to, once you chose your subject and got the camera set up, you had to pour colloidal, a silver nitrate solution with colloidal, so it would stick onto the plate. You had to stick it into the camera really fast. You can see the little kid there holding a plate, his assistant. And then you, to expose it, you would reach around, take the lens cap off, count 1, 2, 3, or whatever your experience told you, put it back on. Then you had to rush it into the tent and develop it right there. There was no waiting for it later. It had to be developed right then. So if you're going to take pictures and develop them, you had to carry all of this stuff with you. Bottles of colloidal, silver nitrate, a great big tent, a big apparatus that Walter Clement Powell, who was on the second trip, he was Powell's young nephew, called it the Infernal Mountain Howitzer, because they had to carry it up cliffs and all over. And the purpose of these, or what they took, were stereoscopic views, like you can see here, and we'll see some examples of others too. You'd use a stereograph, which is the viewer there, stick a stereoscope in it, and you got a 3D view. It was a real popular thing in the late 19th century. It was a parlor. Everybody had stereoscopes. Thousands, tens of thousands, if not millions of those were produced. Here is where on both trips, they kind of bought a lot of their last minute things, just like you do. You know, if you're going on a river trip today and you stop at the Walmart in Price to get something, they went to Jake Field's store. Jake Fields was who had followed the railroad across Wyoming and set up this store. Jack Sumner, who was on the 1869 crew, commented that while they were waiting for everybody to show up, he said, we tried to drink up all the whiskey there was in town, but since Jake Fields made it faster than we could drink it, we failed in the endeavor. This is Scotts Bottoms, which is about 4 miles downriver from Green River, from the town. This is as far up as Flaming Gorge Reservoir normally reaches. Right now it's lower, but this is also today a very nice park. There's a nice park at Green River and at the Expedition Island, and they have a little kayak wave, and then there's a bike path all the way down to Scotts Bottom. So it's a very, very nice community setup. So this is just to give an idea of what the terrain was like from Green River down for about 70 miles, was all flat water, low hills, gravelly hills. And fortunately for Powell, he was there in May, the end of May, and the water was still high. Otherwise, this was mosquito heaven. This is just not a place you wanted to be when the water started to drop, as many, many people commented later. So let's see. There we go. This is one of the boats was named the Kitty Clyde's Sister, and Jack Sumner wrote, as the Kitty's crew has been using the whip in late years more than the oar, she ran on a sandbar in the middle of the river, got off of that, ran ashore on the east side near the mouth of Bitter Creek, but finally got off and came down to the rest of the fleet in gallant style, her crew swearing that she would not gee or haw worth a cuss. Gee and haw were verbal commands that were used to steer oxen right or left, along with your reins. Now, one thing we'd always kind of wondered about as river historians was, where does that name come from, Kitty Clyde's Sister? And it was actually a song that was popular during the Civil War, and nobody really put those two together. But I was able to, a guy on a river history group that I belong to, track down the sheet music. So I sent it to a good friend of mine who's a banjo player. He sent it to a friend of his who recorded it for us. So we won't play the whole thing, but we'll just play a little bit of it.
Minnie Clyde, Kitty Clyde's Sister, words and music by LVH Crosby, performance by Bill Evans. Oh, long have I sung of sweet Kitty Clyde, who lived at the foot of the hill. And though that sweet pretty bird has flown, another is living there still. Minnie Clyde,
Okay.
Clyde's sister.
That really gets stuck in your head. It has in mine. Anyway, this is another take on the 1922 USGS, the Woolley survey. Just to give an idea of what, I can imagine Powell's men on both trips doing the same thing, pulling over, getting the camera out, and the crewmen just sitting there holding the boats, sitting on a sandbank. So that's why I like this photo. Here's some aerial views of taken in the 1950s as part of the Flaming Gorge survey as they were getting ready to build Flaming Gorge Dam, just to give you an idea what the land was like and the colors and everything. These are just open country. And that's what was characteristic of the green for 70 miles. Once you get down into probably 20 miles above Flaming Gorge, above where the river enters the canyons, you come to a place called Firehole Towers. By then, the land has started to rise. They're gravelly Morrison formation, also lots of pinnacles like this and cliffs. This one was taken by Beeman, and you can see that stereoscopic view. If you had a stereograph and you put this in it, you would get a 3D view of it. Here's another view of the Firehole Towers. This one is hand tinted. It was a glass plate that was hand tinted for an acetylene torch magic lantern show. So these were on glass plates, you know, about 2 by 2, and then you would put them one at a time into a projector that later used, at first used acetylene light, acetylene torch, but later used an electric light, and that would project it onto the wall. And it was an early form of slideshows. Here's a view of the Uintah Mountains below Black's Fort. One fun thing about 1849, there was a guy named William Manley who came down the river looking for a way to California. He had left the Oregon or the California Trail at the crossing, the Sweetwater crossing above Green River. And as they were floating along and they saw the river come close to the mountains, he said, we weren't about to go through any hole in the mountains, and it looked like we were going to go overland to Salt Lake after all, because he had been told by the surgeon of a troop of dragoons who were on their way to Oregon that it went to a place called Brown's Hole. And so Manley, it turned out, was not correct, but interesting story. Here's another view just above Flaming Gorge. One of the nice things about the USGS survey in 1922 is they carried a panorama camera, which was you'd wind it up. It was a clockwork driven camera, and it had a little slot in the middle, and the lens was behind that, and then you'd set it off and it would gradually go around and take these big panorama pictures. Here's the entrance to Flaming Gorge, again by Beeman, and you notice on the sides of the cabinet card, the card stock that it's on, it says by J.W. Powell and A.H. Thompson, but some of these were really elaborate. On the backs of these would be just very Victorian, very elaborate writing and drawings and stuff. So right there at the mouth of Flaming Gorge, oops, go back. Previous. Let's see, there we are. There was a long held legend in Green River and around the river of the Green River Suck, which was supposed to be this terrible place that no boat could get through and you would die. You know, it was as good as dying to go through that. And that story was well known to the mountain men who were there in the 1820s. William Ashley had gone down the river in 1825. One of the men with him, he wasn't actually on the river with Ashley, but he was with that party. Ashley's group was a guy named James Beckworth. Beckworth was an escaped slave, and he had gone west and joined the mountain men, joined the fur trade. So he wrote about the Green River Suck. We were encamped, as we had discovered during our frequent excursions, at the head of a great fall of the Green River, where it passes through the Utah Mountains. The current at a small distance from our camp became exceedingly rapid, drew towards the center from each shore. This place we named the Suck. This fall continued for 6 or 8 miles, making a sheer descent in the entire distance of upwards of 250 feet. The river was filled with rocks and ledges and frequent sharp curves, having high mountains and perpendicular cliffs on each side. It makes a great story, but actually Beckworth wasn't there. He had been sent with a land party into the Uintah Mountains to look for beaver, which was a point of Ashley's trip, and it didn't actually exist. So I always wondered, where did that legend come from? And what had finally dawned on me after I talked to a woman named Barbara Williams, who had a ranch right above the picture you're looking at now near a little town called Linwood that was flooded by Flaming Gorge. And the thing to remember here too is that at the time, you know, now you think of the Green, if you go below the dam, it's this little limpid stream, 1,000 cubic feet per second. You know, it's very rare to have much more water than that. But at the time, when the snow melted in the Wind River Mountains, which are the main source of the Green, it could run up to 25,000 cubic feet per second. It was a big, muddy, muscular stream. It would take out whole groves of cottonwood trees and later on ranches and farms. And Barbara told me actually that they had pasture on the other side of the river, and they had these 2 prize bulls they wanted to get into the pasture from Linwood. So they went 10 miles upstream, about where that last picture was taken, 10 miles upstream, and tried to swim the bulls across, and they were caught in turbulence, and both bulls were unfortunately sucked down and drowned. So it just shows you I really think that's where the idea of the Green River Suck came from, besides Beckworth's breathless description, which is not true at all. The greatest fall of any of the canyons on the green is 25 feet per mile rather than the 250 feet per mile that Beckworth said. Okay, so here's an aerial photo of Green River or Flaming Gorge. You can see it's coming from the flatlands, comes into this. Flaming Gorge was actually really short. It was named for that color of the rocks, the Triassic rocks. And then it just made a curve. And then as you can see around, it went on into what's now called Horseshoe Canyon, likewise a very, very short little canyon. And here's, this one's kind of muted, but you get an idea of the color, the Flaming Gorge color. This was taken in 1956, I think. So the next little canyon would be Horseshoe Canyon, which was just a U. The river just went around a point of gray limestone, and that's why it's called Horseshoe Canyon. Now, so Powell, in his exploration of the Colorado River and its canyons, kind of the standard work on the whole thing, wrote about the rapid in Horseshoe Canyon. Our first rapid is run. Now the river turns abruptly around a point to the right, and the waters plunge swiftly down among great rocks. Here we have our first experience with canyon rapids. I stand up on the deck of my boat to seek a way among the wave-beaten rocks. All untried as we are with such waters, the moments are filled with intense anxiety. Soon our boats reach the swift current. A stroke or two, now on this side, now on that. We thread the narrow passage with exhilarating velocity, mounting the high waves whose foaming crests dash over us, plunging into the troughs until we reach the quiet water below, and then comes a feeling of great relief. Well, Mary Beckwith, who was with the Mexican expeditions in 1956, commented that on we glide past Powell's little gem of a rapid, their first big thrill, to us a ruffle around a rock. Now, admittedly, this photo here was actually taken in September 1909. So it's not quite the same. But when the water was high, as Powell was there, I mean, it could have been 20,000, 15,000 CFS. It could have caused a lot more waves and stuff, but still, as Powell was very florid and very apt to exaggerate. Let's put it that way. So after Horseshoe Canyon, this is called Nielsen Flat from a guy named Ole Nielsen, who operated a sawmill there, and Red Bench because of course, the color of the rocks. Powell, as they were floating along, Powell saw many belted kingfishers, and their songs entertained them. And so he called this next little short canyon, Kingfisher Canyon. Now, the next past Kingfisher Canyon was Sheep Creek. And today you can still go, you can go down Sheep Creek. It's actually a scenic drive. If you go off the main highway that goes from Flaming Gorge to Manila, you can take a little side tour off through the geologic drive on Sheep Creek, and it's beautiful. It's just amazing, and there's big springs, and there's a picnic ground and all kinds of things. So it's well worth it. This is the mouth of Sheep Creek. In 1917, the USGS also did a land survey before the boating survey in 1922. So you get an idea. This is looking upstream, and then the river, of course, is flowing down toward the bottom of the image. This is Beeman, Sheep Creek. And here's, this is on the Stone expedition in 1909, Galloway Stone, where Nathaniel Galloway was the boatman and Julius Stone was kind of the sponsor of the whole thing. Okay, so this is another place that's now flooded, of course, Beehive Rock. Powell named this. He said, our general course this day as sorry, I'm covered up by the little thing in the corner. But here the river turns to the east around a point which is rounded to the shape of a dome. On its sides, little cells have been carved by the action of the water, and in these pits, which cover the face of the dome, hundreds of swallows have built their nests. As they flit about the cliff, they look like swarms of bees, giving to the whole the appearance of a colossal beehive of the old-time form. So we name this Beehive Point. And those were, of course, that sound was swallows. Now below Beehive Point, the river opened out into a place called Hideout Flat. It was called that because there were several hidden trails that came down to the river at this point, and there was a shallow place where you could cross the river down by these islands. And so there was this area was really kind of a haunt of outlaws and was well known for that there were many who used this trail. It was kind of, there were a lot of different extensions of the outlaw trail. And so this was one of them. So there's a great story in 1911 of the Cole brothers who were floating along here in their two boats, and they saw somebody on the shore and they waved him to the side. And they said, well, will you help us get this herd of horses across the river? We need somebody to kind of guide them. And they said, oh, sure. So they helped them herd the horses across the river. And then later on, they got down into Browns Park and mentioned it to other people. And they said, oh, you just helped them steal that whole herd of horses, because they were notorious outlaws, apparently, that had stolen the horses, and the Colbs had helped them. Now we come into Red Canyon, which is where the river is coming north and south, and then all of a sudden turns abruptly to the east, just a 90-degree turn to the east, and enters Red Canyon. If you've ever been in the Canyon of Lador, you know just what Red Canyon looked like, because it was the same rocks. It was Uintah Mountain quartzite, and it ran right along the spine, still runs, but it's covered up, along the spine of the Uintah Mountains. So hard rocks make hard rapids. This is Francis Marion Bishop, who was on the second expedition. He wrote, today we start out for a run of a series of rapids, and we know not what shall be. I expect we will get a ducking at noon. Well, we have got it. The ducking, I mean, and the way we got it was thusly. In the second rapid, we shipped pretty near a barrel of water and stopped to bail out. All being ready, we pulled out, and in about 15 minutes, we came to a sharp bend, and in the bend of a strong current, which set over to the west side. Our boat was caught and made it impossible for us to head downstream. Hurdles bang against the rocks, knocking a hole in her side and rolling the Nellie Powell upside down and necessitating an abrupt disembarking of the crew of the said Nellie P. For a few minutes, things were pretty lively. We lost our camp kettle, sponge, and my compass, but no one got wet. I sprang to the rope and then onto the rocks, giving it a twist around a rock to hold her from going down the stream. With a sharp, strong pull up the bank, she gradually righted up and floated 4 or 5 inches above water with her middle hatches full. We hauled her in and bailed out and commenced to repair. In about an hour and a half, we got started again and ran down to the other boats. Now, the other boats were downstream where they could see the Nellie Powell and the problems they were having, see it turn upside down, but they couldn't help. And Powell kind of ran back and climbed way up on a cliff above it and was looking down. And I'm sure that his thoughts were of Disaster Falls in 1869, when one boat had been wrecked and a third of their supplies had been lost. And so he was very relieved to see the Nellie Powell come downstream virtually unscathed. So here's another view of Hideout Flat. In the 30s, there was the CCC built a camp in there and a trail, a better trail, and actually a road down into it. It's all covered up too, of course. Okay, so Red Canyon. We're in Red Canyon, which is, as I mentioned, where the river turns abruptly, enters the Uintah Mountain quartzite, and it gets much more difficult. If you were at this, this is from the Red Canyon Overlook. So you can see the same site today from the Overlook, which you can drive out to and walk along a little trail, but the water's going to be quite a ways up, probably up to that first band of rock in there. And so it's not going to look anything like it does now, of course. But that's where they first ran into rapids. There were a lot of rapids in Red Creek. Jack Sumner, as they started running him in 1869, he said it was like sparking a black-eyed girl, just dangerous enough to be exciting. Here's another shot of Red Canyon. This was taken in 1955. The dots you see on it are called redox. That's oxygen reduction, and that was a problem with a lot of Kodachrome film in the 1950s and 60s. They had a lot of problems with it, and it deteriorated. This is Skull Creek Rapids, which is one of the bigger ones too. It's one of the more dangerous rapids in Red Creek. This was taken in 1950. And here's one of the things that made Skull Creek so notorious. A guy named Theodore Hook in 1869 heard about, he had followed the railroad across, and he heard about Powell and he thought he was going prospecting. So as Frederick Dellenbaugh, who was on the 1871 expedition, wrote, Hook had declared that if Powell could descend the river, he could too. He headed a party to follow. The motive, I believe, was prospecting. I do not know how far they expected to go, but this is as far as they got. Their abandoned boats, flat-bottomed and adequate, still lay half buried in sand on the left-hand bank. Old sacks, ropes, oars, etc., emphasized the completeness of the disaster. So what had happened was Hook and his men came to Skull Creek, and they were swept into it. Hook's boat was overturned, and he was thrown into the river. Everybody else was able to make it to one side. He ended up on a rock in the middle of the river and was standing there. And before the other men could get one of the boats and a rope and go over to him, he decided to try to swim, and he jumped in, was swept away, and drowned. Now, Dellenbaugh says that his grave was right there, but this grave is actually in Browns Park, right by the Jarvie Ranch. So who knows, but nobody's ever looked in there to see, but this is where there are a couple other graves right there on the entrance into the Jarvie Ranch. Carter Creek. The other thing, it wasn't just rapids and gloomy canyon walls in Red Canyon. It was also lots of beautiful clear streams coming in full of fish, clean water. These are a couple of views of Carter Creek, which is one of them. And as you drive above Flaming Gorge, you go across the upper part of it. Here's this is another one of those tinted, hand tinted plates from the 22 expedition. And then these are, that's Genevieve de Colmont and Bernard de Colmont on the 1938 French kayaker expedition in September of 1938. And you see what they're doing. They're having a nice drink of cool water because you can see the river behind them. Now, before we get to Ashley Falls, one last story about that. There's another one called Currant Creek. That's the same thing. Beautiful, clear water, trout, great place to camp, and there were a lot of currant bushes there. A guy named Bill Purdy, who was the schoolmaster in Manila, right while the dam was being built, used to take people down. He had a folding kayak, and he would get boats and take his friends down. So they camped at Currant Creek one night, and a friend of his took his bedroll and went up around the currant bushes. And Purdy said, bears really like those bushes, so I wouldn't really camp there. And the guy said, oh yeah, no problem. And so that night, Purdy was sleeping right on the beach, and he heard this yelling, and he looked up out of his bedroll and saw this guy running naked across the beach being chased by a bear. And so he said he just pulled it back over his head and went back to sleep. So Ashley Falls. This was actually the biggest rapid on the green, and it's about 4 miles above Flaming Gorge Dam, so it's now covered up, of course. And you can tell it's a huge thing. And it looks here, this is taken by Beeman, June, I think it's June 1871. Again, I can't see my thing, but it was a big rapid, and it was harder than it looked harder than it was, put it that way. And the reason it looks here, the water looks so smooth, is because of the length of time it took to make an exposure with these. So there was a lot of, quite a bit of time, so the water kind of smooths out. Now, Powell and his men, when they came to this in 1869 and in 1871, they lined their boats. They tried lining their boats, and one of the boats kind of got, lining means it's what they're doing right there. Actually, the boats are unloaded. They're held onto with ropes on either end. The men get up on the rocks and hold them, and then you let them down along the side of the rapid. It was very difficult and very dangerous, and you could easily be pulled into the river. And as you can tell, none of them are wearing life jackets. Powell was the only one who wore an inflatable rubber life vest because he only had one arm. So you could be dragged into the river, you could be dragged down onto the rocks and bang your face and just all kinds of things. It was very, very difficult. And once the one boat, they tried it, and it got so badly beat up that they carried the boats over these boulders that you see right here. They lifted the 1,000-pound, 17 feet long oak boats, double-ribbed oak boats, over these rocks and carried them. Now, Ashley Falls, the name comes from William Ashley, who in 1825 decided that came west to look for a beaver, to look for fur. And so he had tried a couple of times before, and those had turned out to be a disaster. So this time he came overland, got to the crossing of the Green River, and decided to split up his party. He sent some up into the Wind River Mountains, some into the Uintas, some downriver on land. And the 8 other men and him, and not James Beckworth, he built bull boats, which were, at the time, there were quite a few buffalo around north of the Uintas. So bull boats were a Native American way of crossing rivers. And what they did was you took willows and you made a frame out of them, usually rounded, or it could be bigger, smaller, whatever you needed. And then you'd cover it with a buffalo skin. If you needed a bigger boat, you got more buffalo skins and you sewed them together using sinew. And they were actually surprisingly light and they were very flexible. So they worked well. And so Ashley and his men set off in those. And when they came to Ashley Falls, it was just too big. So they unloaded their boats, carried them around, and went on. But while they were doing that, Ashley stopped and carved his name and then kind of painted it in probably in like gunpowder or grease on the rocks. Frederick Dellenbaugh again in 1871 wrote, "On one of my trips over the rocks with cargo, I made a slight detour in the return to see the boulder where the major had discovered Ashley's name with a date. The letters were in black, just under a slight projection, and were surprisingly distinct, considering the 46 years of exposure. The 2 is illegible and looked like a 3. None of our party seemed to know that it could only been a 2, for by the year 1835, Ashley had sold out and had given up the fur business in the mountains." So these are again Beeman, and as I said, the smooth appearance of the water is due to that long exposure. So these are the one on the left is looking downstream, the one on the right is looking upstream after they had gotten past. You can see one of the boats in the right-hand picture down in the right-hand corner, one of the boats that has gotten by it. Now, if you look, you see the big rock in the middle, which Nathaniel Galloway called a cubular rock. It was about the size of a house. And if you look straight across that little line of waves, there's another big boulder on the side. That was the site of the river register at Ashley Falls. Many, many people carved and painted and left their names there. And that, unfortunately, of course, that was all covered up by Flaming Gorge Dam, by the reservoir. Here's a couple of examples. Amosburg and Buzz Holmstrom, Phil Lundstrom in 1938. The one on the right is, oops, sorry. The one on the right is from the Stone Expedition in 1909. And there were quite a few others too. Here's just some clips from a 1956 Mexican Head Expeditions trip. We had to really compress the heck out of this to get it to, that's why it's so fuzzy. But you can see they're going into Flaming Gorge. Here they are in Horseshoe Canyon. And that's Frank Wright at the oars. And there's, this is the gray limestone in Horseshoe Canyon. Ashley Falls, bang. I always love this picture. This guy just gets submerged in Ashley Falls. This is one of the Mexican Head Expeditions boats. So here comes another guy, one of the other boats, and seeing he almost gets launched over the front of the boat as he's going down. And then the last guy on the trip, he's coming along. Everything looks fine. He gets surfed off to the left, and all of a sudden, whoa, wait a minute, I'm going to hit the rocks. Bang. He crashes into the rocks, bounces off, and goes. If you notice here at the end of this, the flat water below it, that's what made Ashley Falls not as hard as you might think, because below it was just a nice smooth run out. There's actually very, very, very few mentions of flips, capsizes in Ashley Falls. The only one I know of is actually Don Harris. I always joke that I'm the world's expert on Ashley Falls, and that and 379 will buy me a Big Mac. So here's a couple other pictures. These are again taken in 1922 by the USGS, and you can see the downstream view. This is in July, so the water's way down, and you can see the rocks. Now this must have just been some big catastrophic thing where a big, huge chunk of the wall fell off and blocked the river. Dellenbaugh, in fact, seemed to think that had just been within a few hundred years, but we all know how that is. I mean, you can't really tell. And then the bottom picture is another one of those nice panoramas that's looking back upstream. Here's just some gratuitous Ashley Falls pictures, just to show you the different aspects of it. The bottom left corner is Norm Neville's in 1947, and that's Ashley Falls at high water. And the bottom right is too. The middle right is 1909 in September, so you can see what the difference is. And then the top right is also in 1909 or 1911 rather. And just look at those rocks. I mean, that's when the water's really low. That's a lot of rocks. So imagine 25,000 CFS going over that. That's going to be quite the scene. Here's another little clip. I always put this one in just because it's fun to watch. This was taken by a guy named Al Morton, who was he was a postman, but he was a member of the Utah Amateur Film Club in the 1950s. He hooked up with Don Harrison, Jack Brenner, and got started on the river in the late 1940s. And then in this one, he has gone with Reynolds Halsey, another Green River, Wyoming-based river outfitter that also uses the same kind of boats, cataract boats, they're called. And this gives you an idea. This is high water. Here comes this guy running the right side, which is kind of rare. At high water, you normally ran Ashley Falls on the left side. I imagine Morton did this because it was better to photograph, but you can see that guy who's fish eyeing, he calls it, almost got over the side, and he almost flipped because he didn't hit the wave straight. So this guy takes a lesson, hits the wave straight, gets surfed off to the side, but still then pull back up toward the rock. And then here comes, this is Morton in his boat. He gets a little sideways too and turns him up, that big lateral wave there. And ooh, again, almost goes off. So yeah.
Someone wants to know, why are the boatmen going stern first through Ashley Falls?
Oh, why are the boatmen going stern first? Well, that's the way people run rapids now. After Nathaniel Galloway in the 1880s started running his boat stern first, everybody kind of realized the value of that the only other way is to turn around, look over your shoulder, and try to pull really hard to go faster than the current. The stern first technique allows you to slow the boat and position yourselves in the river side to side. People still use that back. If you really want strength, you turn around and you pull, and that's called poweling. But most people, virtually everyone today, another one who used it in the 1890s was, his name just went out of my head. He wrote the Log of the Panthon. Sorry, there it went. Anyway, Norm Neville's called that face your danger, that technique. And he's the one who developed those kinds of boats, the cataract boat. And then that were kind of that, and the hatch, which is, the hatch boat was kind of a modified Galloway style, which is the ones that were like the USGS used. Everybody used stern first by then. It was just more efficient. So below Ashley Falls, you went past Cart Creek, which is the site of the Flaming Gorge Dam now, and then the lower end of Red Canyon. These I took on a trip with my daughter Sarah in 2011, and you see as you're lowering, the walls are lowering as you're coming toward Browns Park. Here's Little Hole, which is today a very popular camp spot, and a lot of people are there. And there's a boat ramp there that is called the A, B, and C sections. So A from the dam down to Little Hole. B, I think, is from Little Hole down to Indian Crossing. And then the C section is down to the bridge, the swinging bridge. I believe that's the case. Now that whole stretch of river is, you could almost walk from boat to boat as with fishermen. It's a primo blue ribbon trout fishery. The cold waters below the dam, the clear waters below the dam are just inhabited by trout and by fishermen and other people too. A lot of people go just to run it because there's no permits or anything. And the water is intensely cold because it's coming right out of the bottom of the dam. And, it's cold water. So Jack Hillers, who was on the 1871 trip and was had been hired just as a camp helper, and later took over the camera after Beeman and Powell had a falling out. And so Walter Clement Powell, who was supposed to be the assistant, couldn't figure it out. They hired a guy named James Fenimore from Salt Lake. His health couldn't handle the rigors of being on the river in those days. And so Hillers just took over and had a real knack for it, became the official photographer for the USGS, took thousands of images for the USGS. He wrote in a book called Photographed All the Best Scenery by Don Fowler, which is Hiller's journal. He says, the major tells us we will have smooth water until we reach Ladore. Started out this morning anticipating smooth water, but had not gone far when we heard a noise resembling a rapid. But of course, having been told that we would have smooth water, we thought nothing of it. But all of a sudden, turning an angle, we found a little rapid around the corner. We got through it all right. Down the river we went, meeting rapids after rapids, some of them as swift as 15 miles an hour. At dinner, some of the boys asked the major if we would have any more smooth water, when he answered, well, about the same. You can imagine he was thinking, smart Alex. So here's Red Creek Rapid, which is the last big rapid in Red Canyon. It's, as you can see, it's this is taken in 1922. As you can see, it's the river goes against a cliff on the right. And then there's a kind of a passage there, and there's a big rock up at the top, and then there's another way on the left, but it's kind of deceptive because there's big rocks down at the bottom of that. And that's actually been the site of quite a few accidents and even some deaths. You know, people have gotten fallen out there, and people are real lax in that stretch, unfortunately. I mean, a lot of times they're just wearing their life jackets, not even zipped up, and the water's still really, really cold. You go out of there, even though there's nothing below it, there's no rapids below it, but it can get you, you know, that immersion hypothermia. Here's Red Creek in 2011. So I was with my daughter, Sarah. We were in my boat, and she said, oh, Dad, let me run this. And it was probably about, I think it was about 8,000. So it was pretty high. And I said, well, are you sure? And she said, yeah. So I sat behind her, and she was rowing the boat through the rapid. And I would say, pull on your oar. And she'd say, shut up, Dad. I'd say, no, push on your oar. Shut up, Dad. I thought it was just like teaching her how to drive. So, but we got through safely, and it was a lot of fun. That was Flaming Gorge Dam, about, I think in 2009. Cashy, come on. No, don't step on it. About 2009, when we went out just to see, they were letting a lot of water out, went out just to see what it was like. Well, that's the end of the Lost Canyons, but I thought I'd actually throw in a couple of Desolation Canyon pictures, considering where we are. And the one on the left, of course, is Lighthouse Rock. These are taken by Beeman in 1871. Lighthouse Rock. And then another photo of the famous chair in 1871. Powell got just a regular old captain's chair and lashed it to the top of the Emma Dean, which was his boat. And it was actually a different boat from the Emma Dean of 1869, but that was his wife's name, and so he kept the name. And then he would sit on that and direct the boatmen and the other boats. And as in the first trip, he used flags. He would have a flag, and he would point, hold it straight up, and that meant go ahead, or he'd point to the left or point to the right to guide people if they weren't going to stop to scout a rapid. You can imagine how this did for the stability of this boat, which was round bottomed and not, it had a lot of weight in it, so it was down in the chine, but pretty stable. Now later that chair became a kind of a thing when Powell left the river, and this was actually in 1872, which is kind of a long story that I won't go into. But so they abandoned the boats at the mouth of Kanab Creek at mile 150 in the Grand Canyon. The chair was left. Dellenbaugh, who stayed around Kanab, Utah, doing surveying all that winter and for the next couple of years, went all the way back down to the mouth of Kanab Creek and retrieved the chair. So he took it back to Salt Lake City and gave it to Francis Marion Bishop, who was also a member of the 1871 crew and had settled in Salt Lake. He was a very, very religious man. Bishop was. He complained all the time that they were working on the Sabbath, that they would not take the day off on Sundays. And so he gave it to Bishop, and there, unfortunately, it was lost to history. And so one of those little mysteries, we'll always wonder where that chair went. Now, this is another famous story that Powell attributes to, I think, to Ledore, but actually happened in Desolation Canyon. This is another one of those illustrations by the guy a couple of years ago. I'm sorry I didn't write down his name. So in Desolation Canyon, Powell liked to climb, and all around, all along the trip, Powell liked to climb up and get a view from the cliffs. He would take barometer readings. He would take, make drawings, all kinds of things, look for fossils. So at one point in Desolation Canyon, he climbs way up on the side, and he gets himself stuck. He's only got one arm, so he's holding on with one arm, and he can't go up and he can't go down, and his knees are starting to shake, and he's not quite sure what to do. So George Bradley, who I doubt looked like the guy in the picture, but anyway, George Bradley scrambles up above him, takes off his drawers, his red wool long johns, reaches them down to Powell, and Powell lets go, starts to fall, grabs it with his strong left hand, and Bradley's able to pull him to safety. That's one of the famous stories of the 1869 expedition. Here is, and those, Candace and those in Green River will recognize this, Gunnison Butte. As Powell wrote, he named it for the lamented Gunnison. John W. Gunnison was a member of the Corps of Topographical Engineers, a unit of the U.S. Army at the time. He was doing one of the Pacific Railroad surveys in 1853 and was crossing the country. He was going through central Utah, got to a place south of Delta, Utah, in the western part of the state. And his party had kind of split up to go different ways and do different things. Gunnison and his men were set upon by a group of Pavant Utes, and they were all killed, massacred. And so Powell knew this, of course, and knew about this because it was the Army, and named it Gunnison Butte. And thank you. This is the grave of John Wesley Powell in Arlington Cemetery. One last quick story, I think I have a minute, is I went there, my daughter Rachel, my technical assistant here, went to college there in Washington, D.C. So we went to visit her, and we went to go see Arlington. My wife's father is buried in Arlington. He was a veteran. And so it was one of those days in DC that are just horrible, hot, humid, gasping, panting. So we went into the visitor center to take a break in the air conditioning before we went up the hill to see my father-in-law's grave. And I noticed there are all these books about John Wesley Powell in the visitor center in the gift shop. And I thought, why? And then Powell's buried in Arlington. So I looked him up, the ladies with a microfilm looked him up. We went up and found him, and found that he is like 5 graves away from my father-in-law's grave, which was a real surprise. And that this is his tombstone. It's made of Vishnu schist from the bottom of the Grand Canyon. So this is Powell's grave. And so that's all I have. And now, so thank you very much. And now let's see, I need to go find, I guess there are questions, if there are questions.
Thanks, Roy. So I've been keeping an eye on the chat box. If anybody has any questions they would like to ask Roy, please go ahead and put them in the chat box. I saw a couple of comments. You must introduce the pet when they visit.
That was Hash Brown, who's we call her our Baltimore street cat.
Gotcha. All right. And Matthew says, let's find Powell's chair. It must be in Utah somewhere.
That's what, there was a guy at the Historical Society named Gary Topping, who was there for years and years and years and years. And he made a concerted search for Powell's chair, and sadly was never able to find it. But it's probably still out there somewhere, sitting in somebody's back room. So I'd love to find it.
Let's see, a couple other questions. Thank you for a great presentation. Awesome. All right, is Powell's headstone really created from GC granite?
That's what I've always been told. I don't know if there are other Grand Canyon folks on the chat who could tell me, but I was told that it was Vishnu schist, which is the bottom of the Grand Canyon.
Awesome. Any other questions? And while any more questions are coming in, I'm going to drop a link to our upcoming events that we still have left over for this month for the Waterways exhibit. So I dropped it in the chat. You should be able to see it now. If you want to click on that, you can kind of see what we have coming up. And if you want to sign up for any of our future events, that is in there.
So I see one question here is, when was the dam built and when was it completed? It started in 1956 and was completed in 1963. And there's actually a great clip of John F. Kennedy in September of 1963 came out to start the generators on the dam, and from Salt Lake City. And so in a film about Flaming Gorge, they talk about the dam, they talk about it. And Kennedy is with Frank Moss, who some of you might remember as a Utah senator at the time. And so they're going to push a button and it's going to start the generator. And the scene cuts to a guy at Flaming Gorge with a great big knob, to turn on the generator. And President Kennedy says, he starts to push it, and then he says, I never know when I push these if I'm going to blow up Boston or something, but here we go. So he pushes the button, the scene cuts to the guy, turning this great big knob, the generator starts to spin, and Flaming Gorge is in operation. It took it until about, I'm not exactly sure about that. I think almost to 1970, but I might be wrong. I'd have to look that up. I'm looking at the chat.
I just saw one from Diane come through. Do you know much about Powell's personal physician, Daniel Prentice?
About what?
Powell's personal physician, Daniel Prentice. Do you know much about him?
I don't. I would recommend, what's that book by Don Worster? River Running West, I think. That's the kind of like everything you ever wanted to know about Powell. Big, thick book. That's a biography of him. And if it's anywhere, it would be there. So I see from Wayne Ranney, who knows everything about Grand Canyon geology, it doesn't look like Vishnu schist, but it may be. Looking on the laptop is hard. That's very true. That's what I was always told, but you're told all kinds of things. So I'm not exactly sure if that's true or not. Any other questions? If not, thanks everybody very much. And thank you, Candace. Thank the Smithsonian for the opportunity to participate in the program. And again, I would highly recommend, I'm not sure how long, Candace, how long is the exhibit there?
It's through June 6th.
Through June 6th?
Yeah. If
you get a chance, go see it. It's really, really great. And even if you miss it, go to the museum, which is a real treasure and kind of the high point of Green River.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Roy. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us this evening. As a reminder, the talk was recorded. So if you came in a little bit late or you want to revisit some of the slides or information, I will be posting it as soon as the video is finished processing. So probably tomorrow, I'll post it to Facebook and also our YouTube page. So please share with your friends if you'd like. So thanks again so much. Y'all have a great evening.
Thank you.